The second archaeological method and theory that archaeologists used in the determination of a functionality of a site is what they call the new archaeology, or scientific archaeology, or deductivist archaeology, or the people that criticize this method and theory call it processual archaeology. And basically what this means is Louis Binford, who was a famous American archaeologist, said that classical archaeology is normative. It's not scientific, because what you're doing is you're just comparing an ancient account to an archaeological site and then determining its functionality. And that's not scientific. It's not deductive. You're not taking a range of possibilities. You're just saying, hey, I found wood on Ararat, and oh my goodness, it must be Noah's Ark. The method that Louis Binford proposed was to form a hypothesis, then establish null hypotheses, and then match the archaeological traits as best you can to see if they match the null hypotheses. If one of the null hypotheses has a lot of the archaeological characteristics that are found at the site, then you can determine the functionality. But if they don't, then you fall back on your original hypothesis. And the way that you determine the functionality of the site is what he described as middle range theory, looking at some modern or cultural practices today to explain an archaeological site or the functions of an archaeological site from the past. Let's go through this exercise for the Ararat Archaeological Site. And here, the hypothesis is that the Ararat Archaeological Site represents Noah's Ark, a maritime barge. The null hypothesis, it's not a maritime barge, it's a land-based structure, a palace, a temple or a cult site, Kurgan burial or some sort of burial, Turkish fortification, an animal pen. And so let's look at each of those in turn and compare them to the features at the Ararat Archaeological Site. First, let's look at burials. A Kurgan burial is usually with a lot of very ornate artifacts, weaponry, skeletons, animal skeletons built under mounds featuring tumuli where you have burials encased under stone. It's very ornate architecture. The Ararat Archaeological Site has nothing like that. First of all, the interior is filled with animal feces, which is not characteristic of a burial ground. You don't want to have the human remains surrounded by filth, but rather a state of sacredness. Also, there is no skeletons of any kind, no animal skeletons, no human skeletons. Also, there's no stone mounds above it. There's no ornate artifacts. It's all utilitarian, simple grinding stones, scoops made of bone and wood. The architecture is massive, monumental architecture. Very linear, but there's no evidence for any burials in the interior. So it's not a burial of any sort, especially a Kurgan burial from the 3rd millennium BC. The artifacts are from the late Epipaleolithic, from not the 3rd millennium BC, but 9,600 BC. So it's not a Kurgan burial or a burial of any type. The next option that you have is some sort of cult site. But here, the site, again, is filled with feces, animal feces. And although there are feces and animal byproducts at some temples in the outer courtyard, they're not found in the interior of the sacred installation, like in the Israelite culture, the Holy of Holies or the holy place. Animals were not permitted to go in there and defecate all around the interior. But that's exactly what you find at the Ararat Archaeological Site. Also, again, there's no ornate artifacts. There's no such thing that represents cult. It's all wood scoops fecal remains, every sort of animal byproduct that's there fills it. So not only do you have the fecal matter, which is throughout the structure, but also hair and fur and reptile skins and insect exoskeletons. Also, what you find is that these are close to storage areas. So very different from a temple where the storage areas are usually outside the area. Here it's all in the interior. Also, the human quarters are not palatial. They're not something that suggests where a deity dwells. No, these are small, cramped, crummy quarters filled with animal droppings and just very nasty. Not something that you would have at a temple. Also at a temple, they have wide open spaces so that you can approach and worship the deity. There's no wide open spaces. The wide open spaces are filled with the fecal matter, and the entire structure is blocked by a series of notched timber ladders. There's also no niches for a deity. It's just strictly utilitarian. Animal feed, animal droppings, animal byproducts, small crummy quarters for the very few human inhabitants. And we're not talking about a palatial estate for priests or cult sites. We're talking about crummy quarters or just a few humans and tons of cages for every sort of animal, from mammals to reptiles to amphibians to insects and to the different types of birds. This is not a temple. Now, what's interesting is you have the main structure that's utilitarian, that's not ornate at all, filled with feces. But on the entrances to the site, different individuals or different cultures built these small little worship areas where they filled these tiny little worship areas from the pottery Neolithic, which is about 8,500 years ago, to modern times, to the Armenian period around 1907, before the Catholicos closed the site, blocked everything, and Armenians carried these artifacts to what is now the Republic of Georgia. So in the interior, all late Epipaleolithic, nothing's ornate, everything's utilitarian, small cramped quarters, filled with feces and animal byproducts, no skeletons whatsoever. But on the entrances to the site, every sort of wonderful, ornate, whole bowls from whiteware from the pottery Neolithic to milk jugs and wine jugs from the Armenian period. But the main structure is not a temple or a cult site. Is it an animal pen? Animal pens are very simple structures, usually made of plentiful material. In the area of Agradagi, or Greater Mount Ararat, they're made of simple stone enclosures, stone circles, if you will. And they're just easy to make, where they keep their caprivine sheep and goats, occasionally cattle, in these enclosures. But here what you have at the Ararat site is monumental architecture. It's 3 decks. It's 158 meters in length. Also, most of the artifacts are from the Levant, from the Bitumen seals to the what they call Cupressa sempervirens, the Mediterranean cypress, to the palm baskets, to the dates. Again, a Levantine assemblage from hundreds of miles away, at least 650 miles away. And you're not carrying huge beams 650 miles away to just form a simple animal pen. So we know it's not an animal pen. Now, the other null hypothesis is that it's a fortification, an Ottoman or a Turkish fortification. Remember, the Ottoman and the Turkish forces are very skilled at military prowess. Remember, in World War I and in the Turkish War of Independence, the Turks defeated the British and the Anzac battalions. They defeated, in their War of Independence in 1922 and 1923, they defeated the French. They defeated the Armenians in the east, and also the Greeks in the west. So they're very accomplished warriors. And one of the things that a Turkish commander would never do is place a a perfectly linear fortification at the bottom of the gorge, which is where you find the Ararat Archaeological Site, in a perfect line surrounded by three ridges. Not only the northern ridge of Greater Mount Ararat, but also the side ridges that run the length along both sides of the Ararat Archaeological Site. And the reason is that the Turkish commanders would know is that an enemy could just walk artillery, what they call walk artillery. You first fire into the initial expanse, and then you do slight adjustments to your artillery or mortars, dispatching everything inside. Another issue is that the entrances to the site are level with the ground, so that there's no buttresses or a type of fortifications that you would expect from a Turkish entrenchment. Also, there's no Turkish or Ottoman artifacts. The only artifact that we found that was Muslim was from an Arab that is found in sub-area B3 in Locus 3. You have no Ottoman or Turkish or Armenian weapons of any kind, no munitions, no martial supplies. All of this, the interior of the structure, is all from the late Epipaleolithic, 13,100 BC to 9,600 BC. And then the little tiny worship areas outside of it, where people are worshiping an area that's filled with animal feces and cages, is from the Neolithic to Armenian. But these are bowls filled with seed and libations of wine and milk. They're not filled with munitions of any kind. So based on the placement of the Ararat Archaeological Site and the artifacts that are either prehistoric or votive objects for worship purposes of an area that's filled with animal feces, this is not a Turkish fortification. Another null hypothesis is that this is just a domestic dwelling. With a domestic dwelling, yes, it's utilitarian, but domestic dwellings are found near areas of food production. The Ararat Archaeological Site is 2,000 meters at least above the vegetation line. It's also not near water sources or agricultural areas. It's also blocked by millions of boulders. Very hard to scale, very hard to access. It's also blocked by an entire gorge of glacial scree. Now, I mentioned it in another video that it's easy, very easy and safe to climb down. It's absolutely treacherous to climb up. It's almost impossible because it's like climbing up a giant sand dune. It takes forever to climb up. And you're fighting against basically a slope of glacial sand-like scree. And also the interior of the site doesn't have the artifacts that represent Agradagi or Eastern Anatolia. Instead, the interior of the Ararat Archaeological Site is filled with Levantine artifacts, or artifacts from the Levant, which is Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. So again, this is not a domestic dwelling. An additional issue is that this is filled with not only all sorts of animal cages, where you have an array of every possible mammal, reptile, insect, and archaeologists are going to be really amazed. Every type of animal feces that you'd ever imagine, every type of animal byproduct, except for the zooarchaeological remains. There's no bone remains, but there's every other type of animal byproduct. But what's a real prize is the archaeobotany. Every type of proto-domesticate or pre-domesticate, from chickpea to pea, cicer, pisum, vicia urvilea, bitter vetch, every type of a cereal grain, rye, wheat, maize, corn, it's wonderful. The wood assemblage is very pronounced. Cupressa sempervirens dominates architecture, but there's also oak and teak, which is interesting because in the Quran, teak is mentioned by the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Okay, back to deductivist archaeology. We know that this is not a domestic dwelling because it's so far away from any type of food source, any type of vegetation. It's also the last place that you would want to keep animals because they would be very damaged by the ascent in order to access this particular site, the Ararat Archaeological Site. So now a palace. The problem is that in a palace or a center for elites, you would have wonderful large rooms or installations for the elite person. Here, the structure is enormous, but the human habitations are small, cramped. They have animal droppings. There's no palatial artifacts. None of the artifacts belong to a palace. Instead, what you have is the most utilitarian artifacts from the late Epipaleolithic. So you have grinding stones, wood bowls covered with mud clay that are burned. You have bone and wood scoops and different types of utensils. You have vats filled with water and wine, or used to be, covered in the interior with resin sealant. So very standard, non-ornate, not something that would belong to a palace or elite person. And also, this structure is very remote from any human source and any type of vegetation. Elites like to have the biggest structure in their community, not 2,000 meters away with no human habitations between them and the people that they're supposed to govern or preside over. So this is a tremendously remote locale with no ornate artifacts, filled with animal feces, which no elite person would tolerate. During the late part of summer, it's absolutely grotesque as the glacier melts and this feces are thawing as well. But no elite person would handle these awful cramped quarters surrounded by the nauseous scent of animal byproducts in various cages and animal feces. So we know it's not a palace. It's unlike a palace. So now that we've eliminated all the null hypotheses, what is the remaining hypothesis? And that it is just as the Islamic prophet Muhammad and in Genesis, Moses wrote in the Pentateuch and Berosus and Josephus and in the accounts of Alexander the Great, that the Ararat site is a maritime barge. And this is what you find. So let's go through the traits. First of all, none of the exterior walls are straight up and down. No, they angle inward toward the central keel. And you see this not only in the hull, but also you see this in the outer shell. And also you see this in all the other features of the archaeological site. And this relates to another feature that we find at the Ararat Archaeological Site dealing with the integrity of a hull. When you're talking about maritime as opposed to terrestrial architecture, with terrestrial architecture, the walls are vertical and they have crossbeams at the top of the wall to support the roof because you're not worried about the walls tipping outward. There's less pressure and stress on the vertical walls. But this is not the case in a maritime structure where the integrity of the hull is paramount. And here, the ways to do that for maritime architecture is what you find at the Ararat Archaeological Site. First of all, crossbeams and notched beams throughout the entire structure, particularly throughout the different elevations of the walls. And the reason is you want to keep the hull and the structure so it doesn't fall outward and it's not crushed by the pressures of the water on the outside of the vessel. And that's what you have at the Ararat Archaeological Site. You have cross beams and notch beams throughout all the walls, the different elevations, not just on the top as you would have in a terrestrial land-based structure, but throughout the walls, at the bottom, in the middle of the elevations of the walls. And you can see this repeatedly throughout the Ararat Archaeological Site. also, there's a lot of different joinery that you have in a maritime structure. A maritime structure features two different types of joinery. It's called Mortise-and-Tenon or Coak-and-Dowel joinery, and let me explain. The goal, again, is to maintain the integrity of the hull, the integrity of the vessel, to prevent water from leaking inside the vessel and to maintain the structural integrity of the hull. And here you have lots of evidence at the Ararat Archaeological Site for both Mortise-and-Tenon joinery, Coak-and-Dowel joinery. What happens is they take wood, a very hard wood, and it inserts into another type of wood that's usually softer as you move from the exterior to the interior of the vessel. And that's what you have at the Ararat Archaeological Site. And the two different types of wood are aged cypress versus fresh cypress. The aged cypress becomes very hard, and because of the stress of it being cut down and aged, it exudes a lot of sap, resinous material, to which the builders of the Ararat Archaeological Site placed the softer cypress wood over the protrusions of the stronger sealed aged cypress. They also did these Mortise-and-Tenon Coak-and-Dowel joinery with oak and cypress. But again, these protrusions and apertures that are fitted together were covered with the two types of sealants, both the cypress sap and resin that served as both a seal and also strengthened the wood, but also the bitumen or the petroleum-based sealant that also served to seal these Mortise-and-Tenon joints to prevent water from seeping in to the interior of the vessel. And you find this type of joinery, the Mortise-and-Tenon and Coak-and-Dowel joinery, not only all over the walls at the various elevations, but also on the different floors. Again, to stabilize, to maintain the integrity of the hull, keep everything together, and keep everything sealed to prevent water from leaking into the vessel. Another trait that is shared between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel is evidence for crustaceans and barnacles on the exterior of a hull. Being in the maritime industry, these organisms are just awful because what they do is they latch onto the hulls of vessels, and if left untreated, they can burrow and bore and really seriously affect the exterior of the hull. And at the Ararat Archaeological Site, the crustaceans and barnacles are evident at sub-area B3, Locus 3 on a section of the hull. And what the builders of the Ararat Archaeological Site did is that first, the planks are of aged cypress, and so were very strong, and they were covered with sap. And that was the first protection, both acting as a sealant and also as a protective measure against maritime organisms. But also, over the top of the resin sealant is bitumen pitch, or a layer of petroleum-based sealant. So these organisms, the crustaceans and barnacles, had to worm their way through the bitumen sealant, then past the resin sap sealant, and then into the very hard and aged cypress planking on the exterior of the Ararat Archaeological Site. The other trait that is shared between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel, and also shows the vessel's origins from the Levant, which is the area of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, southern Syria, and southern Lebanon, is the amount of coral and sedimentary rock. And a coral artifact, artifact 14, Locus 4, in sub-area A1 was found. But these coral are combined with lots of sedimentary stones, which are unlike the basalt or the volcanic rocks that we found at Agradagi or on Mount Ararat. And these are located in sub-area A3, where a section of the ballast features broke away as the archaeological site was being forced down the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat due to the tremendous pressure of the ice from the glacier. The combination of just the heaviness that was inside the ballast feature and the pressure of the glacial ice broke this area away. And so you not only have large beams of cypress and large planks of cypress, but also a variety of lithic material, including sedimentary rock and also coral. And this again shows that the builders of the Ararat Archaeological Site were taking any lithic material, not just basalt, but also sedimentary rock and coral, whatever they found that was in the Levantine area, and putting it in these ballast features to help stabilize the vessel. Another example is that the site is built with wood that is not conducive to electricity. So all the seafaring woods of Comprises, of cypress, of oak, and teak. Also that these are built of a familiar way the use of stone adzes. Another trait that is shared between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel is the use of sealants. At the Ararat Archaeological Site, there are two. One is resin. When cypress, which is used predominantly throughout the Ararat Archaeological Site, is cut down and left to dry, it exudes sap that not only smells very nice, but it also seals the wood. But there's not only sap that is used to seal, but also bitumen, which is a petroleum-based sealant that is used throughout the Levant, particularly in Sabia, which is a site in Kuwait during the Neolithic. Another trait that is shared between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel is ballast along the east and west sides of the entire length of the site on the bottom deck. And in modern vessels, they have ballast tanks where water is drawn in and then forced out to increase the buoyancy and stability of the vessel. But here at the archaeological site, they have cypress beams. They're holding back small, medium, and large size boulders, and these features are situated between the exterior hull of the vessel and the interior outer shell, and they run almost the entire length of the eastern and western sides, or the port and starboard sides, of the Ararat Archaeological Site. And this again is to stabilize the site in heavy seas. Another trait that is fully evident between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel is the use of desiccants. Desiccants are used to remove moisture and are often some type of silicate. But here at the Ararat Archaeological Site, it's very evident in Locus 8, a huge cargo hold in sub-area A1 with the use of wattle or tree stems that line the exterior of the cargo hold. So you have chutes where primarily chickpea seeds and seeds of pea and bitter vetch were forced to the chute into a cargo hold that was lined on the exterior with wattle or tree stems wrapped in linen and flax cords. and this was used to prevent moisture from affecting the seeds that were in the interior of this cargo hold. Another trait that is shared between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel is the employment of 3 decks. Now, multiple floors or decks in maritime architecture are to increase the amount of cargo that can be placed within the vessel. And this is what you have at the Ararat Archaeological Site, where 3 different decks, the top, middle, and bottom, are filled with large pens or small cages. But this leads to another trait that is shared between the Ararat Archaeological Site and a maritime vessel, and that is the use of ladders or stairways between the different decks, usually on the port and starboard side and also in the center of the vessel. And this is what you have at the Ararat Archaeological Site, but they're not stairs, they're notched timbers of cypress, and these are also covered with the bitumen or the petroleum-based sealant. Also, this is a specific type of barge. What they call today is a Trot-on, Trot-off, or a Toto barge. You have all successful barge operators that are in the transport of animals. They don't have or skeletal remains. What they have is the non-skeleton byproducts, because you don't want the animals to die in transit. But what's left behind is the animal feces, the hair and the fur and the feathers of when you're transporting mass amounts of chicken. But here you have every type of animal, including insects and amphibians, as we see from the scutes and the discarded skins and the exoskeletons. It's just wonderful for archaeologists. And then you have the archaeobotany, where you have huge cargo holds with chutes, where the builders of the Ararat Archaeological Site poured chickpea seeds, pea and bitter vetch, into these chutes that gathered in these enormous cargo holds. That's also indicative of a Toto or Trot-on, Trot-off maritime barge. You also have very small crew quarters. Being on a ship, I was a maritime executive, you don't have huge palatial, only the captain has, but here you have tiny little installations. But what's very interesting is all the furniture, it's wood furniture, attached to the walls. And this is a very clear characteristic of maritime transportation, where during rough seas, you don't want tables and chairs flipping onto the inhabitants of the staterooms. No, you want them fixed to the walls so that if the vessel is in rough seas, you're not going to injure the inhabitants of the vessel. Also, you have thousands upon thousands of cages, from the very small cages, 20 centimeters, to the very large cages, some associated with wood tongs. So they're carrying all sorts of animals, from the mammals to the avian remains, birds, reptiles, insects. Again, another indication of a maritime barge, specifically a Trot-on, Trot-off barge. Another characteristic that you have on Trot-on, Trot-off barge, angled floors, where animals are led up or down into the cages and in the pens where they're supposed to be. And this is again indicative of what you find at the Ararat Archaeological Site. Not only are the large pens sloping, even the small cages are sloping, and then you have the main floors that go the length of the ship that are sloping, which is a good way to lead animals safely in and out of the Trot-on, Trot-off barge, but also to clean the area of feces and other non-skeletal remains. Again, you have all the different types of features that you have in a Trot-on, Trot-off barge. And the middle range theory is modern maritime transportation to explain the functionality, and that we have the primary hypothesis fulfilled that matches all the traits, And you have Moses in Genesis, the Islamic prophet Muhammad, Berosus, Josephus, and the Alexandrian legends say that Noah's Ark was a trot-on, trot-off barge, and because that is what the archaeological traits in the Ararat Archaeological Site reflect, a maritime trot-on, trot-off barge, we definitively conclude that the Ararat Archaeological Site is Noah's Ark, or Noah's boat. Thank you.